Okay, thank you all. Thank you for your cooperation on that schedule change. We really appreciate it. We hope you enjoyed your lunch. I understand there's more food available, so if you would like some more, please go get it. And I think there's refreshments in the back as well. So now I'm going to turn the floor over to my colleague, Martin Evans, who's the CEO of the Carnegie UK Trust. And Martin will tell us a little bit about the background for this project, Wellbeing in Northern Ireland, and then we'll proceed after that to the presentations. So, thank you.
Thanks very much, Joel, and it's a complete pleasure to be working with Joel and his team. Again, we have been doing occasional work together for the last 7 or 8 years. It's always good to be either Joel is across in the United Kingdom or we're here. And what we find is that sometimes you can say something in a different country and it's heard more clearly in the country you're actually addressing. So in part, our hope here is all the great things we're doing, you are doing in Northern Ireland can be reflected both back to Northern Ireland, and we up the idea and understanding of what's happening in the States. So I'm hoping I'm now going to tell you just a little bit about the Carnegie UK Trust for those of you who don't know. You have in front of you the map that confused most people in the United Kingdom, let alone abroad. So Britain is Scotland, Wales and Ireland. The United Kingdom is the United Kingdom of Great Britain, which is those, and Northern Ireland. And Ireland, of course, is that blue bit, which we don't have to name because you know it so well. And we still work in all of those jurisdictions, including Ireland, because we were set up by Andrew Carnegie when Ireland was still part of the United Kingdom. And we have been delighted to still work that. And you'll hear a little bit about our work in Ireland, because it's complementary but different from our work in Northern Ireland. Strangely enough, and to our great benefit, and when Andrew Carnegie set up the trust, he had a very short phrase: we were to improve the well-being of the people of the United Kingdom. That's all he said. That was the job of the trustees. And he said to the trustees, and you have to make choices as the needs of the people change from time to time. So the trustees are not looking back to what Andrew Carnegie thought, they're looking forward to what the needs of the people are at the time. And we are very lucky we have this word, which is now quite common, maybe getting slightly overused, but for 100 years we've had that requirement. And our work on enabling wellbeing is working across a range of areas, and we are very pleased that Rolf Alter is here because we work with the OECD. It's a big program of theirs on on wellbeing, and we've done work on regional wellbeing, which I'll come back to. But this is both an intellectual process, we produce reports, but also a practical process. We want to work with people, and I hope by the end of today you'll have an understanding about our practical work both in Northern Ireland and a little bit in the Republic of Ireland. If you know Carnegie at all, you know libraries. And we are funded over the 100 years, 600 libraries across the United Kingdom and Ireland. And we're still very actively engaged in public library policy through these kind of practical works. We do research. This was the largest research on libraries ever undertaken in the United Kingdom. Over 5 years, we interviewed 10,000 people about their use of libraries in order to confound the received views of libraries. And one of the things I'm never tired of saying, the highest age group that uses libraries is 16 to 25-year-olds. The received view, they're all in decline. It's older people sitting there quietly. It isn't. It's young people using libraries, and that has to be shouted very loudly, because if you don't do research, you don't know what's really happening, and we're proud of our research and our research in public libraries. The trust is required to take risk, and this is a picture of a lodge that we built in the Trossachs in Scotland, and we built it to significant opposition from elsewhere, which we weren't allowed to build in beautiful places, in order that people who didn't have access to private transport could visit the outdoors and have somewhere to shelter in those places where, as in the Trossachs, it tends to snow or rain, one or the other. So The risk and reputation that the Trust wants to pursue are not little risks, not big risks for little gain, but big risks for big gain. And that's a constant discussion that we have. And I think our work reflects some of that. And of course, you get things wrong when you take risks. And that's important to realize that you have to have mitigation on risk, but I'm proud of that. I'm going to go tell you three other things we're doing. We're based in a town. We are the largest town-based foundation in the United Kingdom. No one else is our size based in a town. When Andrew Carnegie set us up, he'd already set up the Dunfermline Carnegie Trust, and he loved it. He liked it. His lawyer was the chair of it, and he said, I would like a UK trust, and I'm going to give it this stipulation. It can fund anywhere in the United Kingdom except Dunfermline. So we're not allowed to fund it, which is a great benefit, because nobody can walk and knock on my door and say, can we just have another swimming pool? Because the Carnegie swimming pool is now 100 years old. Well, they can do, then they do that, but we can't fund them. So flourishing towns is very important, and we just produced a report, which we're going to Berlin to talk about in 2 weeks' time, about Brexit and towns. Because Brexit, the author wanted to call it Brexit, the revenge of towns. Towns voted to leave. They voted to leave whether they were deprived towns or successful towns, and for different reasons they voted. And a significant 40% of people live in towns. In the United Kingdom, and it's an unrecognised public policy area, squeezed between strong rural lobby and a very effective city lobby. But it's been squeezed out of the public policy debate. So we have to have that as a theme as 5 years. And fulfilling work. When we working on, this is one of our themes, because it's the same in America. I was reading this. The employment figures are sky high. There are more people in work than over the last 50 or 60 years. So employment is at a very high level. What we now worry about is the quality of that work. What matters is how you're working. And again, this is an evidence-based issue for us. And so we've been working with a range of partners on measuring and defining fulfilling work. And part of that is the same story as other things, is that we were invited privately to do this by people who had political authority and power, but they needed to conserve that. So can you work and build a consensus? If you can't build a consensus, they don't have to spend their political capital. So we have just published our report on measuring fulfilling work, and I was at the Conservative Party conference last week talking about this, and we are hoping it will be taken on. My final theme is about digital futures. We know well-being of the people relies enormously on the digital in the future, and we're doing a lot of work on this idea of social justice and digital, and we're just starting to work. I was asking Joel's advice about this, about the regulation of digital, and we're working quite strongly this idea of do no harm, finding ways that they can self-regulate, because this is a contested area, more in, I must say, in America, where you butts up against the individual rights that the Senator was talking about, rather than the collective responsibilities. So that's a fascinating area of work, not short of risk there. I'm just going to come back very briefly and say this is from Rolf's organisation, Regional Comparisons, and we like to say to people, seek unusual friends. When you're seeking change, seek unusual friends. If you talk to people you know, May knows this, when you're trying to change, if you talk to people you know, you just get an echo chamber of what you already think. So when we are saying to people, and we're saying it to our colleagues in the local authorities, look, your well-being profile in Northern Ireland is very similar to the well-being profile of Quebec or Eastern and Northern Finland. Now, these days, you don't have to go and visit those places. You can talk to them. You can, how are you doing? How is your changing world? You can also find people who are doing far better than you and ask them how they've done it. And hopefully they'll find you and say, how did you do that? So these regional comparisons data drive very interesting pieces of work, especially in our work in local government, which I hope you'll get a flavour of some of it through the day. This is what we're doing, and this is my last 3 slides. When the Northern Ireland Assembly government fell, we wanted to carry on doing some work, and Aideen was my co-chair on the round table leading to the work you're going to discuss this afternoon. And the board wanted to carry on doing that. So we invited each of the 11 authorities in Northern Ireland, would they be a partner with us in looking to work? And there are quite a number of them in the room today who are our on this early journey of finding out more. And we're not grant aiding them, we are partnering, and with some of our resources help them do things which they wouldn't otherwise do in public. And we're making a fairly large investment for ourselves, finding a way that they can work together to find unusual friends. And we're meeting tomorrow in the Carnegie Corporation building on Madison Avenue with a range of American and Canadian partners who are working in this area too. These are the places. They are fantastic partners to be with. As I said, we've got 2 years, and we're just getting to know each other, and we hope to get to know each other far better and work together over the period. And just going back, these are the two people from the two parties who were in government at the time we did our work with Aideen. Simon Hamilton from the DUP and Dathia Mackay from Sinn Féin. And they gave us a degree of permission privately to do this work together for that same reason in other areas. It allowed them to preserve their political capital, to test the water, for us to say, well, what is this about? What is a wellbeing framework, and what is the outcome? And when we produced our report, they were good enough to put this into the forward. It's time to place well-being of our citizens at the heart of what government's about. And the reason why this was important in terms of a discussion in well-being, in terms of a society that's divided, is you could have a conversation about the future which didn't depend on where the resources were currently being allocated. You could say, and the Senator said this, what were your aspirations? And you would probably find your aspirations for your children, for your family, for yourself, were no different wherever you were. And so an outcomes-based framework, wellbeing framework, became in part a contribution to a programme for government that was draft published before the Assembly government worked. Here's the domains of wellbeing. You've got a little leaflet on your table about it. It's much more complicated than just feeling good or being healthy. It's quite a sophisticated conversation. And I'm going to leave it like that. I'm hoping you've got an idea that we're working on a range of issues, and this has been a fantastic journey for us. And I reflect what the Senator was saying about the welcome that we have received when we've been working across Ireland and Northern Ireland. It's a fantastic, energising. And to say in this forum, the work that's been done in Northern Ireland actually is more interesting on wellbeing than the work that's been done in almost every other, in fact, I'd probably say any other jurisdiction in the world. As interesting, if not more interesting, than Estonia. As interesting and more interesting somewhere else. So it's worth shouting about that, but I know that I've worked in Scotland for 30 years, and Northern Ireland's the same. You don't like to shout about your successes, but hopefully we'll talk about it in a rational way, in a very positive way, and you'll hear what's going on. So thanks very much indeed. Okay. Just before Joel comes up, we've had to make some alterations. We're absolutely delighted. We now have a video from the DUP. Arlene Foster sends her sincere apologies. She would have liked to come. She wishes us well, but she had to go to the Brexit discussion. And we have Martin here from Sinn Féin. We're very grateful for that. Michelle O'Neill had accepted our invitation and then broke her leg. Michelle is the leader of Sinn Féin. Arlene is leader of DUP. And I don't say that in any way to diminish what we're going to hear. Fantastic. And Joel will now hold the fort, or hold the ring, while we have these two great presentations. Thank you.
Thank you for that overview. I have very little actual introduction into this video. Just wanted to set it up by underlining what Martin had said. We had hoped to have political leadership from both sides represented here, and so we do have this video which will roll now, and then we'll hear from Marcin after the video. So let's just let it go.
Delegates, I'm delighted to be addressing today the Carnegie International Seminar on Wellbeing in Northern Ireland, and specifically on the topic of where is Northern Ireland now. For most of you who don't know me, let me introduce myself. I'm Peter Weir. I'm a member of the Assembly representing the Democratic Unionist Party, and I'm speaking today on behalf of both the DUP and our party leader, Arlene Foster. I've served in the Assembly since 1998 and was recently Minister of Education. I welcome this opportunity because politics, I suppose, is often has a sense of immediacy about it. It has an element of firefighting, of solving or hopefully actually averting the latest crisis. So it's good once in a while to take a step back and try and offer a perspective of strategic reflection where we can look not only at where Northern Ireland has come from, but where it is going. At the outset, I think it's important to recognise that over the last 20 years, it would be wrong not to reflect the many changes and improvements that have happened throughout Northern Ireland. But it would also be foolhardy not to recognise that with progress, there's been limitations to that progress, and indeed there is a long way to go. It is the case that where we have got to was perhaps initially helped in the short term by a certain amount of ambiguity in our conflict resolution. But I think that that ambiguity has long since served its purpose. And indeed, ambiguity is no longer a friend to us. Starting, I think, with the positive, obviously the biggest change that has happened in Northern Ireland over the last 20 years has been an embedding of peace within our system. Now, let me make it absolutely clear from the start. It is my belief, my party's belief, that there was never an excuse from violence from either side. No one should have lost their lives at any stage in the Troubles. Terrorism and violence was always wrong. And so, at times, there is perhaps a reluctance to give credit for removing an evil which should never have been there in the first place. It is also the case that in terms of peace, that there is a valid criticism that what we have is an imperfect peace in Northern Ireland. Since 1998, more than 150 people have been murdered as a result of terrorism. Now, that is a terrible figure. Indeed, any death is something to be deplored. But I think we need to contrast that with the over 3,500 people that lost their lives during the Northern Ireland Troubles. It is therefore at least a relative peace. The other caveat I would add is that we see, still 20 years on from the Belfast Agreement, the continuing existence of paramilitary activity, organisations which are still active within their own communities. That is something we believe is totally unacceptable, and we will support any positive moves which can take people out of that past, but also for those who are still wedded to violence and criminality need to be dealt with by way of the forces of law. Despite, I suppose, those limitations, there is no doubt over the last 20 years, for most ordinary people, life has changed for the better. There is a much greater opportunity for all our people, particularly a generation that has come since the ceasefires, a freedom of movement, a freedom to enjoy their lives for our young people, which is to be greatly cherished. I would say as well, there is no appetite within any section of our community to return to those days of violence. And indeed, some who would try to use that threat as a means for particular political ends are to be deplored. We can at least, I believe, look forward in Northern Ireland to a much more peaceful future than we've had in the past. The second positive, I think, that has happened over the last 20 years has been improvements in our economy. We today have a greater number of people in employment in Northern Ireland than we've had at any stage in our history. We have seen successful inward investment to the extent that for many years, with the exception of London and the South East, we've had the greatest level of inward investment of anywhere in the United Kingdom. Now, while help from countries overseas have been very helpful, that has been born out of the skills of our workforce, over a highly educated workforce, and indeed the advantages that we can offer to inward investment. We have seen a growth in our knowledge economy to the extent that it is now worth 3 billion in terms of exports. And again, for the last 4 years outside of London, we have been the fastest growing region of the United Kingdom. We have, as home of the Game of Thrones, a burgeoning set of creative industries which are being built upon. So there is much within our economy to be positive. Of course, within any society, it will mean that some communities feel left behind who have not enjoyed the full economic benefits of a growth in our economy. And it is still the case that as a society we have too great a dependence on the public sector in terms of employment. We need still a step change in what we are delivering in terms of private sector investment and private sector initiatives. There has also, over the last 20 years, been a greater acceptance of the rule of law and of policing. it is now the case that the courts are recognised by virtually everybody. And similarly with policing, there is a widespread acceptance of policing. The key test that was often challenged towards Republican communities, that if a crime happened on the streets, would they contact the police, is now something which has been got beyond, and indeed there is that level of acceptance. However, it is important to acknowledge that that success has been very slow and at times piecemeal. The failure to nail down the issue of policing and the acceptance of the courts of law in the Belfast Agreement in 1998 meant that really it wasn't until 2006 or 2007 that there was acceptance by all parties in Northern Ireland that the police were something that should be embraced by all. And similarly, the slowness over terrorist organisations, particularly the IRA, getting rid of their weapons through decommissioning, created great political instability in the years after the Belfast Agreement. There is, I believe, still ambiguity over the past, and indeed the principle of consent in terms of Northern Ireland, while it has been acknowledged, it's sometimes, particularly by Republicans and nationalists, ignored whenever they want to. As we move forward, particularly in policing, it must go beyond simple acceptance, but also a realisation that policing offers the best way forward for many careers, and indeed an encouragement to everyone in the community to be involved in policing. Fourthly, I suppose there's a positive. For much of the time over the last 20 years, we've had a local regional government. While government anywhere in the world can be criticised, sometimes abused by people, it has provided an accountable and, above all, accessible forum for local people throughout much of the last 2 decades. It has meant that solutions can be tailored from a Northern Ireland perspective to meet our local needs. And that contrasts with a situation where we had direct rule ministers simply flying in and flying out at frequent intervals. Now, there is still a question mark over the stability of those institutions, but nevertheless, when they have worked, I believe they have worked well for people. Now, despite the progress, I think there are still many challenges that are out there. Firstly, we've seen over the last decade the implications of the worldwide recession. This has meant a sharp contrast from the early days of the period in which the Belfast Agreement was established, where public finances were healthy, where indeed the arguments were essentially over where additional resources could be placed. And there is no doubt that some of the pressures over public finances have added to political pressure within Northern Ireland. And at one stage, disputes over welfare reform threatened to derail the Assembly in total. With those additional pressures, deciding, for instance, where cuts need to be made, there is a need for a more mature politics, which can actually, with politicians, stand up and make critical strategic decisions. And while there's been some progress in that direction, I think there's much still to be done. Secondly, the uncertainty over Brexit has undoubtedly created tensions across the community. And indeed, not knowing precisely where we're going to be at has stoked up fears and concerns. Now, I believe that some of those issues have been hyped by some people politically for their own ends. For our part, we are determined to try and reach a sensible Brexit, one that protects and enhances the economy of Northern Ireland and ensures that there aren't artificial barriers put up either between Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom, or indeed between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. We need, in short, a deal that works for everyone. And we believe through our efforts that people are prepared to be sensible on this. That is something which ultimately can be achieved, and the problems of Brexit overcome and the opportunities grasped. The biggest, I suppose, challenge that has been placed before us is the stability of our political institutions. Again, the ambiguity that lay at the heart of the initial settlement has on a number of occasions created political instability. In the first decade of the Assembly, there was very much a start-stop situation where it collapsed on numerous occasions. And there remains at the heart of our institutions a problem that either community can effectively veto those institutions there is the opportunity for collapse at a whim, and sadly that is what we saw last year with Sinn Féin. The collapse, I think, of the Assembly in 2017 has damaged community reconciliation and set back a lot of the good work that has happened. I believe that we need something which removes the levels of uncertainty around the stability of the institutions, where the latest crisis did not lead to the institutions themselves collapsing. And so we need to inject within any settlement stability into the institutions, which moves beyond simply trust and can therefore be robust enough to survive different disagreements. Power sharing, I think, is here to stay, but that doesn't mean that every aspect of the institutions as established under the Belfast Agreement are sacrosanct. We must always strive to do better. Finally, I think the fourth area that is a major challenge is that of legacy. Dealing with the troubles and particularly the deaths and injuries of the past. Again, the initial settlement in 1998, while it was enough to bring us forward in terms of conflict and resolution, created at its heart a level of ambiguity around the differentiation between terrorism and democracy. And I believe that that ambiguity has haunted the process ever since. There is no common narrative over what has happened in the past. And currently, for example, in terms of definition, no difference or distinction drawn between the bomb maker and the bomb victim. Many of those in our society still suffer the raw wounds of the Troubles, both physically and psychologically. And an inability to get an agreement around the past, I think, has haunted our political process. And we've seen, even this week, widespread concerns over the government's proposals on dealing with legacy. Now, sometimes it is often the case in Northern Ireland that we look to see where the difficulties are. But I take a much more optimistic view. I would say, despite the challenges, despite the failures, and indeed despite some of the setbacks that we routinely suffered, I, indeed my party, remain profoundly optimistic. In Northern Ireland, I think we have a very resilient people who went through decades of terrorism and the Troubles and have come out the other side, not unscathed, but ultimately as a people intact. I believe for our people in Northern Ireland, the prospects are good, and I think those prospects can be improved if we see the re-establishment of a stable, devolved government, trying to answer the concerns of all our people. We cannot allow the rhetoric of a few people to drag us back into a bunker mentality which simply divides Northern Ireland into two communities and creates war by other means. I think we need to see acceptance of all our cultural identities and beliefs. And if we have a genuine respect across the sectarian divide for all our self-identification and communities, I think we can achieve a more stable Northern Ireland. If we achieve a more stable Northern Ireland, we have a more settled community in a way that we can actually improve things for Northern Ireland. I believe the best is yet to come for Northern Ireland, and despite our difficulties, I think that is something that can be achieved.
Thank you. I'm now going to recognize Marcin Almayer to give your remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Someone said come here and talk about a society which is divided, where vitriol and invective is the order of the day, where legislators are really almost at war. But I decided not to speak about the US. We're going to concentrate on home instead. Boilan Buhasort Carnegie is Curricura and Hopton Shaw live in St. Ool War. Big thanks to Carnegie, to Martin, to Lucy, to Ali, to John, for inviting us and for the great work they're doing in the Wellbeing project, which really is a peace building and peace embedding project. And I'm really grateful to you for affording us the opportunity to be here today. And then thanks as well perhaps that most eloquent of all the people in the US who speaks about the peace process, Senator George Mitchell. But it's worth saying that even in his absence now, that we would have no peace process without America, without Irish America, of course, but without America. So amidst the many turbulent arguments and that atmosphere of discord that is here, Americans should be very, very proud of having created what is one of the great exemplary peace processes in the world. When I had the privilege of serving as a Lord Mayor of Belfast in 2013-14, people said that was a clerical error, but I managed to hold on for one whole year. I spoke often of the dual priorities of building the peace and fostering reconciliation. Baroness May Blood is here, and Councillor William Leatham is here from the DUP as well. And I think that it has been my experience that where you try to meet unionist people halfway, that they were always there. That the people on the ground wanted very much to see peace and reconciliation. Those of us who are committed to putting well-being at the very heart of government, we will acknowledge that the absence of warfare is an essential starting point. And the Carnegie materials, they emphasize how important it is to remove war. I think that has been delivered at home. And likewise, reconciliation, celebrating difference, facilitating diversity, those are all things which are essential if you want to treasure well-being. And so I was right to emphasize peacemaking and reconciliation, but actually on reflection now, 5 years on, I think I missed another essential cornerstone of building peace, embedding well-being. And that's the need for justice and equality for all. For without justice, you can't have proper reconciliation. Without justice, you imperil the peace. And without justice, you can't truly foster well-being. And of course, and I admire and respect Peter Weir, my colleague, my former colleague, but my belief is that the impasse we're experiencing is because of a lack of justice and equality at the heart of our government structures. I agree that it's a disgrace we have been without government for over 600 days and counting. I am heartened by the fact that great work is continuing to go on, especially at the local level, and no one needs permission from a government which is paralysed to continue to build community, to encourage prosperity, and to build for the future. It is true that we can't make progress on major projects. One of my favourites is to double the size of the university in the city of Derry, an initiative which would transform the city and its citizens. You cannot make progress on those mega initiatives without government. And therefore, the absence of political institutions is an indictment. It's an indictment on me. It's an indictment on all who are in a position of leadership. But let me suggest some other areas which Peter didn't mention, which may be the reasons why we don't have a government at the minute. And for me, it's a source of pride that the reason why we're without political institutions is because many of our citizens demanded just and equal treatment. They withdrew their support, their confidence in the government. These people want to be at the table. They want to be at the Carnegie round table. They want to ride at the front of the bus. They believe in the gospel of Harlem poet Langston Hughes, and we're close to Harlem. I'm going to quote 3 poets and 1 politician. And Langston Hughes wrote, "I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody will dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I too sing America." So the Good Friday Agreement of 1998, which of course America helped to midwife, is rooted in the belief that everyone in the north of Ireland should be treated equally. The Good Friday Agreement brought to a close almost 30 years of absolutely harrowing warfare. The gift of peace was the greatest gift my generation ever received. When I first entered Belfast City Hall In 1987, I wore a flak jacket. I was thrown out of my first meeting by the police after 10 minutes. People said, how did they stick you for 10 minutes? And I witnessed many attacks on my council colleagues. Our offices in City Hall were bombed, and I walked behind too many coffins. But the people facing me, the unionist representatives, they walked behind just as many coffins as I walked behind. Their suffering was exactly the same as my suffering. And yet the Good Friday Agreement rescued us from that. It represented this historic compromise that I accepted. There would only be a united Ireland when a majority in Northern Ireland voted for it. But the British government and the unionists, they accepted everyone would be treated exactly the same, and that Irish identity would receive what we called parity of esteem, which is basically just a beautiful word for equal respect. And it's no coincidence that when the political institutions collapsed in January 17, that the late Martin McGuinness, then the Deputy First Minister, he said it was a lack of respect from the DUP which had eroded public confidence in the institutions and had made it impossible for them to continue. So in my view, our pursuit of well-being will not succeed until all in political leadership accept that despite the hurt we have endured and inflicted for the sake of our children and our grandchildren, that we have to focus on the common good, on the common weal. The war is over. 4 absolutely beautiful words. The war is over. The mindset of war has to be consigned to the dustbin, no matter how painful, and it is painful for some people to do that. As Michael Longley, free man of Belfast, another great poet, wrote in Ceasefire, I get down on my knees and do what must be done and kiss Achilles' hand, the killer of my son. So as Peter said, there's no agreed narrative on the past. My dear friend Sammy Douglas in the DUP remembers being in America and getting a call. His brother had been shot, his cousin, a part-time UDR soldier, had been shot dead by one of the Republican groups, and the hurt that caused him. I have stood over the body of Alan Lundy, a father of 5, shot in the head in May Day 1993 while working on the house of a council colleague of mine. And anyone who's been through that not only treasures what we have, but is absolutely committed to making sure that it pertains. So what has happened? What has changed? I think the late Dr. Ian Paisley, he put it wonderfully. And this little quote which really captures the spirit of making peace. When I was finishing off as mayor, I invited him into City Hall for a reception with the President of Ireland. And a journalist said to him, but what's it like? Because when you were in politics in your pomp, Sinn Féin would never have had the mayorship of Belfast. In fact, Belfast was a very strong unionist city. And now it has flipped. It has changed, really. It's a very diverse city now in terms of political representation. And they said, what's it like for you? Have to be welcomed by a Sinn Féin mayor. And he said, we meet, we don't draw swords. We have certain things that are precious to one another. We believe that every man, every woman, has the right to hold on to what he believes is good. But people are beginning to see that there's a unity between one part of Ireland and the other. That doesn't mean that the Ulster Unionists are all going to bow down to them. And it doesn't mean that Dublin is going to bow down. It means that we understand one another, and while we hold strong to what we believe, we also believe that they have just as much right. What beautiful words. We meet, we don't draw swords. And the reality is, to all my friends from home here, they know that when the DUP and Sinn Féin meet today, when we meet, we draw swords. Metaphorical sword, but we draw swords. So that's where we were 5 years ago, and it would be hard to argue then that we have made progress in that aspect of building peace. And in my view, Brexit's all about drawing swords. It's all about looking inwards, looking backwards, and the threat of opposing Brexit against the democratically expressed will of the people of the north of Ireland, to me, is a disgrace. And yet I am confident, as Peter is, that the power-sharing institutions in the north of Ireland will be restored at some point. But I'm not a fool. I don't think they're going to be restored in short order. But that word power sharing goes to the very heart of the values of inclusion and compromise, which are key to Carnegie and which epitomise well-being, inclusion, a place for everyone at the table. Power sharing, what a powerful word. But the roadblocks to the restoration of the institutions all speak to a denial of the principles of equality, respect, and inclusion. So I'm going to explain what some of those are. And also my belief that if we remove the blockages which led to the fall of the institutions, why they would be in everyone's interest. In my view, no one will lose out if, as promised back in 2007 by the British government, we had an Irish Language Act which gave Irish speakers in the north the same type of protections available in those radical countries, Scotland and Wales, and across the rest of Ireland. In my view, we all gain if marriage equality is guaranteed as a right, as demanded by the LGBT community and by the majority of our people and by the majority of members of the legislature, as it is again everywhere else on our islands. I think it is unsustainable when a majority of MLAs support more liberal laws on abortion, that the north of Ireland has the most restrictive abortion laws in Europe, perhaps with the exception of the Faroe Islands, but I'm not even sure about that. And of course, in relation to the past, we can't make peace with the past if we continue to deny families access to inquests, as is happening now. But whether in a future united and agreed Ireland or today in the north of Ireland, I want to see a society which cherishes all its people equally. A society with zero tolerance of religious sectarianism and racism. A society which affords opportunity on the basis of merit. A society in which the Irish identity, the Ulster Scots identity, are celebrated and promoted as shared treasures. Belfast is one of the youngest cities in Europe, and I do hope our friends in America get an opportunity to visit. I'm talking about in terms of its demographics. The youngest city in Europe in terms of demographics is Dublin, and Belfast is number 3 or 4. But there's huge change happening in Belfast. Government in or out. The US companies which have established European headquarters there include Citigroup, which is 2,500 employees, of New York, which is 2,500 employees, in Belfast, Liberty Mutual of Boston, which is 450 employees, Belfast, Allstate of Chicago. We had the New York Stock Exchange and the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, which is like a peace process, both in Belfast at the same time. And interestingly, all those major blue chip global companies recently united behind a charter demanding marriage equality. Very unusual for corporates to come out strong on a civil rights issue, but they did that recently in Belfast. And of course, many of those companies take part in the annual Pride Parade, which is now the largest parade in Belfast. We have a lot of parades in Belfast, so having the largest is some boast. So I want to finish with a little reflection. When I was, this is like the guy you meet, Ulrich says what I used to be, but anyway, when I was the Lord Mayor of Belfast, I had a Buddhist chaplain. In fact, I had a Hindu chaplain, a Baha'i chaplain, and a Muslim chaplain, and the Rabbi of Belfast. And the Christians had the four main churches, because as you know in Ireland, the Christians argue a lot. So everyone else got one. But my Buddhist chaplain was a man called Paul Haller. And if you want a really good Buddhist priest, go to Belfast. Because he left Belfast in 1972, very good year to leave. And he travelled the world that way, via Thailand, Japan, and then to San Francisco, where he eventually became to occupy the highest position in Zen Buddhism in North America, is the abbot of the San Francisco Zen monastery there. And I called him up and I said, Paul, will you be my Buddhist chaplain? And I said, now there will be some responsibilities with this. And he said, of course I will. He said, because I have huge experience of dealing with hopeless cases. But I have to say that he gave me very good advice and gave our society very good advice. He actually came back and established in Belfast the Black Mountain Zen Centre, working with wounded people who have the trauma of the past, of our troubles and conflict, people who are wounded by addictions and other things. He works with wounded people. But his advice was that if you want to build a better society, a society with well-being at its heart, that you have to act with kindness and compassion and the knowledge to each other, and the knowledge we all live in each other's shelter in this connected world. So I pledge to continue that work of reconciliation, of peace building, and of ensuring that justice flows like a river. And so I end with a lyric, it may be a prayer, from our greatest poet, Belfast's greatest poet, Van Morrison. And I offer it to my unionist neighbours in the belief that even in these difficult, challenging, polarised times, that we'll find a way to live together in peace and mutual respect with well-being for all as our objective. And as Van Morrison wrote or sang, from the dark end of the street to the bright side of the road, we'll be lovers once again on the bright side of the road. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Why don't you stay up here? So, thank you very much for that. So we have about 30 minutes for conversation. I'm sorry that Peter is not with us, but perhaps some of you who know him and his work and his position of his party and so on can help us out. But what I thought I would do is just open up the floor. You can take questions. We can have conversation. We've got 30 minutes. I noticed a lot of discussion about ambiguity, but also resilience. Resilience for this process. So I thought maybe I would just sort of kick it off. I know most people are familiar with the situation. So you said 600 days without government.
Yes, yeah.
And so if I could just put you on the spot for a moment to get us started, is there one thing in particular, if you could focus on one thing in particular to restart the process or to get it going, what might that be to help us focus this conversation?
Well, I identified, my view, some of the blockages there, but I do want to say that I want to emphasize that while politicians are paralysed, civic society shouldn't be paralysed, social enterprises shouldn't be paralysed, integrated school movement shouldn't be paralysed, sporting groups shouldn't be paralysed, councils shouldn't be paralysed. So whatever about our inability, and you've heard me set out my reasons, Peter actually said what he thought the problem was, but I do want to stress that if everybody was depending on politicians, we'd be in a very sorry state, because I don't think there will be rapid movement or breakthrough. And so I say that, number one. Number two, it's amazing how we have lost the art of the peace process. So I'm very rarely in a room anymore where people are just with their political opposites having a conversation, maybe about housing or about trying to obtain grants. The great beauty of the European Union, when they came in with their peace money, it was the first time I'd been around a table with unionist colleagues on common cause, making common cause. So there's a need also to resurrect that work, that very basic work of having opposites in terms of politics together. But the other things I said, and they are huge obstacles, because the things I've outlined, the DUP is insisting they will not concede on these issues of what I see as justice as equality. So we are log jammed, but there may be someone here who's a genius to get us out of that.
All right.
Our Tourism Ireland, of course, because interestingly, since the government went down, the tourism figures have gone through the roof, and Alison Badcock, Tourism Ireland. So, and the investment, Andrea's up there from Invest Northern Ireland. Since we went away, Andrea seems to be just doing better. So.
Questions, comments, discussion?
We won't do 30 minutes. We definitely won't do 30 minutes, that's
okay.
for sure.
All right.
Okay. But we might do 3 if somebody asks a question.
Yes, please.
You have a particular view from Belfast, but one of the things Carnegie UK talked about was the importance of the towns. Could you speak a little bit about the perspective from your outlying towns in the rural areas?
Well, the Carnegie partners here all represent rural areas, I believe. I'm thrilled to hear that Carnegie has stayed loyal to Dunfermline, because we don't suffer in Ireland, north or south, we don't suffer the decimation of inner cities, which has been the experience in America. But our towns have been, I think, abandoned. Also the move from retail to online, It's very easy for a village to go on a downward spiral. I just went through the town of Portadown, where really commerce has been sucked from the city into, which Americans would be familiar with malls outside town, and so the vitality and life of the towns is going. So I think that's a danger. The bits where the towns are very strong are community organisations, sporting organisations, boxing organisations, credit unions, civic society. But I do think that our towns have some challenges. I don't know if it's true or not, but I have a feeling that there are no peace walls in any of our towns outside Belfast, and with the exception of Derry, but it's Portadown as a peace wall. God Almighty. Okay. So, but largely, yeah. So largely, our rural towns don't have. I don't know if that's true. Somebody could maybe from there could tell me. Does it have the severity of the division that Belfast has? I have 66. I could give you. We have 66 in Belfast, I believe.
Over here, yes, sir. If you could wait for the microphone, that'd be great. Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm Rolf Halter from the OECD previously. I would just wonder, you know, when you listen to these really perfect interventions, I still wonder what it is that makes a blockage. I mean, a blockage, the ones that you cited, Martin, I thought, as you very well know, you look around the world, these are not things that are not going away anywhere else either, easily. There's a lot of discussion about those things. So this is not a specific Irish, Northern Irish, UK, European issue. It's everywhere. So I do think blockages of that nature exist, and it takes a while to overcome them. I've not seen them being solved easily anywhere. That's just to say, you are different, but not that much different than the rest of the world. No? But what I was also wondering, and this is where I ask you, Senator Mitchell made a fantastic plea here, really impressive. I wonder, in your view, does it take an external push to make you come, as you said, sit with your opposites at the table? Does it take an injection of someone with a lot of goodwill and perhaps also a bit of knowledge about Northern Ireland to overcome that? Or is it really something that can only be homemade? And I'm saying that because this experience that you seem to have from 1998 with a lot of talk and a lot of external engagement helped a lot. And it got to a very, very decisive step of achievement. Is this the way to consider perhaps another of these big, not big, I'm not talking big, but of these interventions from the outside of help, not of imposing? Thank you.
Well, I think first of all, yes, it is. I think frustrating to people that we resolved issues of the armed campaigns, the decommissioning of weapons, release of prisoners, big issues. And then these issues which appear to be smaller cannot be resolved. That is interesting, intriguing, but it is a reality that if we put the government back today as it was in December 16, it will not last 1 month. So, but I marvel at that we managed to do the huge things. Personally, I think external intervention is always useful. You won't get a George Mitchell every day of the week. But I personally think, it's just a personal view, I do think that I consider this an external intervention, is useful. Whether or not that would be, there's some talk about an external chair for new talks. But here's another spanner in the works. The British government is reliant absolutely on the DUP to remain in power. So you're trying to push that boulder up a hill, and there is a difficulty that the British government, if it upsets the DUP, and the DUP seems a little bit upset the last few days in the discussion around Brexit. But the British government is not in the position, I think, to give that push, to make that intervention, to say there'll be elections or there'll be talks. So the Secretary of State, British Secretary of State, said, I think at our conference, that there'd be talks in October. Then there was no contact. I think she was in Belfast yesterday. There's no talk about talks. So, you know, as if life wasn't complicated enough, there is that added part of the equation, which is, I think, slowing us down at the minute. Ralph, what do you think about external intervention?
Seriously, I think, you see, one of the most immediate, not external interventions, but supporters, should be actually coming from the Europeans themselves. You know? It's a region, I have to say. It's one of the 186 regions that exist in the European Union. I do think there should be a way to deal with that. And this is not to belittle, nothing to do with that. It's just that I think Europeans should be in a position these days to find solutions that are feasible and are agreed and agreeable. And I don't think that we need to be looking so far. But if someone else, like it happened in 1998, someone else is such a good friend of Northern Ireland as the US, at least some parts of the US seem to be, if that's the place, well, then it's that place. It's just that I make my point about Europe as not just an association of very competitive people in business. I thought I have a little bit more. And if I'm here with your fantastic hospitality, Joel, ethics matter. For God's sake, why wouldn't we say this in Europe? And then just go.
Marcin, just a couple of things. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Norman Houston. I'm the diplomat representing Northern Ireland in the United States. Just on the gentleman's point, first of all, about the chair of the talks, this has come up quite a lot, as you can imagine, in Washington over recent months. And I think the issue really is identifying someone that all sides would recognise as something of a sort of a new George Mitchell. But I'll just make one comment on that. I know at the time there was the issue over the welfare reform in Northern Ireland, and the parties were at loggerheads about whether it would go through or not. Professor Eileen Edmondson came in from Ulster University, and I think there was an agreement at that stage, whatever the professor come up with, the parties would accept. And I just wonder, and I'll throw this out really, that if you were to get someone to come in and there was an agreement beforehand that this learned person would be the arbiter of what needed to be done, you know, would that be a way around things in the sense that everybody had signed up to it? I mean, there's no answer to that question, but it's just throwing it out there. My question, and I think I may be trespassing a little bit into the next session, is that everyone, yourself and Peter Weir, talked about the rising tide of the economy, Alison's fantastic tourism figures and Andrea's great figures of inward investment. But one of the things that comes across my desk a lot in Washington is the idea that there are still a considerable number of people at home that haven't felt the rising tide of economic renaissance. Have you any comment on what you would like to see done for those people who are still struggling to see that the peace process actually has made a difference in their lives?
Yeah, and I can't remember your first comment, Norman, but you were saying about Eileen Avildsen, of course, did a great job as an independent person. So if you get somebody who's independent but would come down on my side, we would accept all the recommendations. I mean, no one should be left behind. There have been improvements. I mean, the statistics, the data tells us that there have been enormous improvements. But we lag behind. So I think the indicator, as referenced against Scotland, Wales, and England, is that we still have more school leavers who have no qualifications. But we've reduced it by, I think, 20 points over the last 20 years. We still have more people without a third level qualification than Scotland, for example. We've increased the number who have a qualification. I see lots of investment. I see ambitious communities with high aspirations, but I also see communities that are left on the edge, in which almost still haven't managed to grasp this changing time we're in. Some communities are locked in the past, you know, and we of course, I was at a police event on Monday night, you know, helping the police, helping the transformation of policing. Policing is also on a journey, and we are bedevilled by these little remnants of paramilitary groups, which in some areas be quite strong, like East Belfast, and in other areas still have a pernicious influence. So have we a bit to go? Absolutely, but I do think there has been enormous change even in the working class areas of that I represent.
What the microphone coming?
Thanks. Quentin Oliver, member of the Carnegie Roundtable. Martin, I'm struck that in your fantastic speech, which was lyrical, poetic, historical, and visionary, you spoke as an observer rather than as an actor in the process. And you reminded us of your fantastic year as mayor, where you even adopted the term Lord, which you said to us this afternoon, which was big for your community. And the things you did in that year, including that session with the late Ian Paisley Sr., as brave actions from a position. Now, you have a position. You are an elected politician. You listen to Peter, and you then observe, interestingly, that you don't have the opportunity to talk. You pass the baton to civil society to rise up and do stuff. What can you do as an active politician without an assembly meeting in order to advance those issues? Will you sit with Peter Weir and discuss educational underachievement? Will you sit with Sammy Douglas? Will you sit with the councils here that are still meeting every day and cutting deals rather than sit above it?
Well, let me say it in two parts. First of all, every day I'm involved with interchanges and cross-community exchanges and bridge building and so on. And that'll continue, and you'll see some of that maybe later this year. We do some of the events in Belfast. But it is true, and I said this earlier, there's a new cohort of MLAs came into the Parliament in March 2017 who have never spoken in the Assembly. The Assembly doesn't sit, the government fell. So they've never actually had any opportunity to meet their counterparts on committees or on the Assembly floor or in exchange visits or whatever. So in my view, the opportunities for getting to know people are less, not on my part, I'm talking about the younger people who, when I meet them in a room, I can't remember their names. So it'd be hard for people to realise who all the new MLAs are. So I do think there's less exchange. I'm content. I'm continuing to work across the divides in South Belfast. But what I will accept is that was an observational overview of where we are, and it was deliberate because we're paralysed. And I can go and meet Christopher Stalford or Mike Nesbitt or Emma Pengelly or whoever, but it will not take away the fact that and those things should happen and will happen. But it will not take away the fact that we are paralysed, and I have identified what I think is necessary to break that logjam. So I accept that almost it is from a position of saying we're stuck. So maybe it's a cri de coeur rather than a refusal to accept responsibility. Don't know if that helps. So that's your 30 minutes gone.
One more. We'll take one more.
I'm Paul Kavanagh from the Derry and Strabane Partnership, and also work in a health service. I mean, living in Derry, there's growing anxiety about a hard border. And I think, Martin, you've probably covered a fair amount about Brexit. We're here to talk about well-being, and Brexit is very, very worrying. Now, it's particularly worrying, I think, in border areas. Derry's a big city that sits on the border. I live half a mile from the border. My children live in Letterkenny and Donegal, so they're just kind of a few miles up the road. But you do wonder, almost the nationalist community in particular. I come from Derry, so it's obvious which community I'm from by the name of the city that I use. But you do wonder, I suppose, how the nationalist community's views are being taken into account at a time when there's no assembly, and at a time as well, as Martin said, that the DUP is propping up the Conservative government. So I wonder, Martin, is there any insight in sort of the discussions that you've been involved in relation to genuinely moving away from this sense of a hard border and genuinely giving a sense to that the kind of the lemming-like leap that we may take in relation to not giving Northern Ireland some special status within the deal to leave the European Union actually will be brought about.
You sort of have a choice. You can take Quentin's paralysis, or you can take the chaos of Brexit. And I have no insight into where this is going to go. So, I'm definitely talking about Brexit as an observer, but then again, I'm not even sure that Mrs. May knows where it's going. I had the great opportunity of addressing 27 ministers of Europe. I sneaked into a meeting in Brussels because the UK was starting to boycott these meetings because they had voted to leave. So there was a space for a UK minister. And since there was no minister from London, they said, does anyone else want to take it? And I said, well, I'm in town. I'll take it. So I had a lovely union flag, marching with you with a union flag. So when they asked for comments, I said, yes, I'd like to speak. And they presumed I was some representative of the government. And I spoke, of course, passionately against Brexit. And I said, you give me the opportunity, I'll finish on this. In 590, now the Yanks don't believe there ever was a 590. But in 590 AD, okay, St. Columbanus sailed from the port of Belfast, from Bangor, to what's now Dunfermline, was now Scotland, to what was then Gaul, now France, set up the monastery at St. Gallen, which is now Switzerland, ended his life in Bobbio in Italy with a little vineyard and making beer, as every saint should. Died in 614, I believe, St. Columbanus. And I said to the ministers, we've been Europeans at least since 590. So whatever about the economic catastrophe or damage that Brexit will do, it's the cultural damage, I think, is so dreadful, detrimental to our well-being. And to think that the EU has been such a great ally, that we're casting that aside. So we'll work to make sure that it doesn't squander the gains we've made or the economic progress, such as it is west of the Bann. So that's my thoughts. And thanks for the wonderful. So can I say again that Norman Houston, we're very lucky. We have Norman Houston in Washington representing us, and Lorraine, of course, who's not here at the minute, who's in Liverpool due to an illness of her brother. But absolute champion of diplomacy, working with both sides throughout. With Martin, we had the great privilege, and both Martin McGuinness, Peter Robinson, Ian Paisley spoke very, very highly. Norman hold him in high regard. So we're very lucky that he is our spearhead. He's the tip of the spear at our diplomatic service. He's maybe a great champion and very patient. And Robert Cushnie's here from the Northern Ireland Bureau as well, who's had a baptism of fire. He's still waiting for his government. He's been since he came into the office, there's been no government. But also Andrea Hawhan from Invest Northern Ireland, who's a whirlwind, the dynamo in this city, keeps on getting people to invest, which of course we understand. We're a little bit baffled that they invest so close to Brexit, but it's magnificent. Andrea, well done. And then Alison Metcalf and the work of Tourism Ireland is absolutely priceless, and nothing has transformed, in my view, Belfast more than this huge explosion in tourism and all the jobs and businesses that have spun out from that. So maybe those three get a round of applause.
That's great. Thank you, Martin. That was a great way to end the session, to talk about all the people who are doing positive things. And I think that's what we're going to be talking about in the next two sessions. So thank you very much for holding forth and for sharing those ideas. Thank you all for contributing. So I think we'll take like about a 5-minute break, and then we'll reconvene with the first panel discussion up here. Thank you. That was great.
I'm John Elvidge. I have the pleasure of being the chair of the Carnegie UK Trust, and we're enormously grateful to everybody for their participation in this event. And our objective now is to keep the spirit of conversation and dialogue going in the room. So we're going to try and provide a little bit of stimulus to that next phase of conversation by offering you a variety of perspectives on where we are now in Northern Ireland. For some of us, it's for some of us it's where we are, and I guess for others of us, to be honest, it's where you are, because the panel we have assembled here is a combination of perspectives rooted in Northern Ireland and perspectives from a slight distance from Northern Ireland. So we have Dr. Teresa Donaldson, the former chief executive of Lisburn City and Castlereagh District Council, Quentin Oliver, the director of Stratagem International, and so both deeply rooted in Northern Ireland, but a citizen of the world, and Rolf Alter, who until about this time last year was the director of the Public Governance and Territorial Development Directorate of the OECD, which was responsible for the major review of governance in Northern Ireland that took place relatively recently, and Rolf had a key role in directing that work. But he also has a broad perspective on which we've been lucky enough in the UK Trust to engage with him on the way in which various countries around the world have engaged with the same kind of journey about using concepts of well-being to unravel some of the difficult challenges that face governments. And I'll say a little bit more about my own perspectives later, but we'll just start with 3 brief introductory statements, and Teresa is going to speak first.
Okay, so hopefully this is working. I'm afraid mine's not so brief because I've prepared a paper which hopefully will bring some of the themes that we're all here to discuss together and maybe change the way the conversation has gone away slightly. So I'm truly delighted, first of all, to have been invited, and extremely grateful to Carnegie for the invitation to participate. I have been part of the roundtable since 2013 and greatly privileged to be so. And anybody who has had a chance, maybe bored enough to read my CV, you'll see that my professional background is somewhat varied, and I've moved between different parts of the public sector before arriving in local government as chief executive. And although while working in health and social care and legal services, there was ministerial control of departments, mainly during my tenure from directorial ministers, I really didn't come face to face with Northern Ireland politicians until I entered local government. So as chief executive in Craigavon Council, and I know about Portadown because Craigavon embraced Portadown, Lurgan and Craigavon, I encountered politics that were publicly polar opposites of each other in terms of really any issue raised. But behind the scenes, there was cooperation across party divides. And what this meant for me as chief executive was that most of the substantive work on issues was done below the radar with party groupings or with party group leaders. And bearing in mind the size of Northern Ireland, the fact that central government departments discharge many responsibilities that would be the business of local government in other jurisdictions. So, we are very small, 1.7 million people. So things like housing, regeneration, social care are discharged from the centre, and this splits issues between communities on the ground that should be joined up It's clear that fragmentation of services has led to inefficiencies and increased costs. We'll hear more about that, no doubt, when Neil's talking from an economist's perspective. We haven't been able to realise the synergies that are very important for any community. But this was an issue that was well discussed and thought through by the Roundtable and thought to have been greatly assisted in other jurisdictions by community planning. And that's the link with the wellbeing agenda and local government. My personal approach nationally, regionally and locally, because I've worked at all those levels in the public and voluntary sectors, has shaped my worldview. And that is a drive to reduce silo working and to be inclusive and uniting. This default position has served me well when building teams across sectoral divides and building consensus in divided groupings when I've been chair, and that means I appreciate initiatives that contribute to this position. So added to this personally, my family, my husband's here, Barry, is all embracing in the Northern Ireland context with religious and educational experiences across the divides. So working with Carnegie with a strategic objective to make cross-sectoral working across government, civil society and business normal and valued has therefore been a joy. So I was invited to join the Roundtable, as I've said, in 2013. And at that time, local government had been promised reform and was recognised as being in need of fundamental change for many years. But political and practical impediments seemed to arise at the last minute to prevent the much-needed overhaul. So while services in local government in Northern Ireland were not complex, considering health and social care had gone through reform a number of years earlier, reducing the number of councils with very limited powers, the 26 councils with limited powers, to 11 with enhanced powers raised political issues that were complex. And we've heard some of that already today. So questions such as what assets would transfer from nationalist to unionist areas and vice versa, and what would the political dominance in the new super councils look like were hotly debated. The Good Friday Agreement of 1998 and the St Andrews in 2006 confirmed the onset of peace and the ending of the war and brought a fully operating Northern Ireland executive. This meant there could now be serious attempts to address the fragmentation of services for a population of 1.7 million, with changes to health, education, legal services and government departments. So as I've said, in 2013, I was delighted to be invited to join the Roundtable to consider the promotion and development of the concept of wellbeing in Northern Ireland at the same time as the OECD was undertaking a public governance review, and the OECD recognising that Northern Ireland faces specific economic, social and political challenges that influence government's ability to design and deliver public services that can effectively and efficiently meet citizens' needs. So compared to what we see now, that was a good time for government in Northern Ireland with an executive that was bringing forward important reforms. The Department for Justice had been established in 2010, and after a decade when the devolution of policing and justice had been under discussion, justice was devolved to the control of the Assembly. And I'm pleased to say that local government reform began to move forward with intent from 2013 onwards. Reform proceeded with the Local Government Act of 2014 and a slew of other legislation passed through the Assembly. And as my job in Craigavon Borough Council as Chief Executive disappeared, I was fortunate to be appointed Chief Executive, Lisburn and Castlereagh City Council on the 1st of April 2015. And after a period in shadow form, the reduction in councils from 26 to 11 materialised. Additional powers were bestowed on councils, including increased economic development powers, in stark contrast to 1973, when directorial from the Westminster government introduced planning powers. These were now restored to councils. And we got things like off-street car parking, which is a bit odd, but anyway, we also got a general power of competence. This was introduced, and community planning powers were given to councils. So having the opportunity to develop community planning as a core initiative in a developing organisation and bringing in-house the thinking that was developing within the Roundtable was very exciting for me. By ensuring colleagues in other councils were informed about the work of the Roundtable, I could, as a member of the Society of Local Authority Chief Executives, influence them as they brought forward their community plans. It was hugely rewarding to be a participant when the programme for government was being developed and to influence the outcomes-based approach heavily influenced by the Scottish model. The work that took place within the Roundtable very significantly influenced my approach to community planning. A brief perusal of the succinct publication from the Roundtable towards a wellbeing framework conveys the collective expertise and wisdom of the group. The language in the report is simple and the objectives are clear. Such things as building the conditions for well-being, deepening the democratic engagement, developing an innovative, fair and sustainable economy, living long and healthy lives, and so on. The outcomes-based draft programme for government reflected much of the thinking and language of this report. The establishing of new ways of working to support well-being, aligning of tiers of government, as the report quoted, people in Northern Ireland are trying to shed a skin and find a face, mindset and disposition. The report and work of the Round Table certainly helped public services to achieve this. So in Lisburn and Castlereagh, I ensured the development of the community plan was led from my office. This enabled me as Chief Executive to support the development of the plan and give it the strategic level of importance demanded. The community planning partnership was chaired by an elected member, Alderman William Leatham, who's here, and has championed community planning in the council from the very get-go. And also I have to mention Catherine McWhirter as our community planning officer. Political neutrality for the process was assured when it was agreed by council that political representatives on the partnership would be cross-party and the extensive consultations would take place in each district electoral area with members of the public and other agencies. We wrote up the outcome of the consultations, thus developing the plan from the bottom up. And although there were also extensive consultations with other public services and the business community and our own staff, we engaged assistance from some of the agencies such as Stratagem, and that ensured that the work of the Round Table was embedded in our approach to the plan. We also ensured alignment to the programme for government. The action plan to take forward the aspirations in the community plan has now been launched. The 5 themes of our plan are children and young people, the economy, health and well-being, where we live in our community, and each theme has 5 associated actions with the lead authority. So how has local government fared as a whole? And interestingly, there has been a review now of all of the community plans across Northern Ireland. And Dr. Johann Gallagher from the University of Ulster conducted an examination of the plans. So as she commented, there has now been in Northern Ireland a greater emphasis on partnership between central and local government, the private sector, voluntary and community sectors to tackle the major challenges. Councils had been advised to align the community plans with the programme for government. It was also noted by Dr. Gallagher that with the publication of the plans, there was a great opportunity to look at collective aspirations regionally and locally. And what did she find? Her analysis showed that all plans published were done so within the 2 years that we had been given. And the plan time frame is 10 to 18 years for most of the plans and some between 13 to 15 years. Most were quite similar in structure and adopted elements of the outcomes-based approach. But what she found was the depth and breadth of engagement with local people was found to be striking. And this was achieved through, for example, workshops, competitions, online surveys, social media activity, and focus groups. Engagements used by some to manage expectations, because that was important. There was no resource from central government to bring forward community planning. This was all done within the resources within councils. Others adopted a more ambitious approach, and the research found a reasonably strong link with the programme for government outcomes. In the plans examined, there was a focus on mental health, environmental issues, and infrastructure. And key observations from Dr. Gallagher that there had been a huge level of public engagement, but perhaps not enough emphasis on audit and targets. And again, I think that's part of the journey that we're all on, and we know from the Scottish experience that the Scotland Performs side of the community planning has been hugely important, and again, we'll hear more, I'm sure, from the speakers about that. But what we have found is that collaboration had begun and must continue and strengthen with partners understanding their roles and expectations around delivery. Dr. Gallagher suggested there should be a focus on performance accountability going forward to reassess actions and resources available and their ability to turn the curve. And while these are important suggestions, but more importantly for me, the culture of community planning in Northern Ireland had now been established, informed by the Wellbeing agenda as progressed by Carnegie UK, and that's an achievement to be acknowledged. So in conclusion, in 2013, Carnegie UK brought many disparate views together to consider how we could work together to advance wellbeing in Northern Ireland. The sharing of learning between jurisdictions of the UK and Ireland, a strategic objective for Carnegie, made so much sense and greatly assisted Northern Ireland going through far-reaching reform as a post-conflict society. I was delighted to participate in the roundtable and bring forward the community planning partnership and Lisburn and Castlereagh City Council, informed by the thinking of the Roundtable. I was delighted, as with the other 10 councils, that I published the plan on time. And while community plans and action plans have been published, the process of getting to where we are now has been far from easy. There have been resistors to change, and certainly the sharing of and pooling of resources between agencies has not happened perhaps in the way we would all like. With the collapse of the Assembly and the weakening of the link between the Programme for Government and community planning, it's become more difficult to achieve the joined up of services as was envisaged. However, having said that, the progress, the great progress that we've made has to be acknowledged. Thank you.
I'm in a sort of Carnegie nirvana here. As some of you know, I work out of a Carnegie library in Belfast, Donegal Road. And last year, my partner and I bought a Carnegie library in North Belfast that we are restoring and giving back to the community. I was a member of the Roundtable with Teresa and many of the rest of you, and now I'm in the Carnegie Council for Ethics and meeting many of the Carnegie family of foundations and trusts who contribute so much from that enigmatic Andrew Carnegie and his journey from the Weaver's Cottage in Dunfermline to the States and back. I've just come from a place with just under 2 million people, with a dispute about language rights and language acts, with a territorial claim of one part to another part, and a recent referendum on the use of the word northern in their title. That was the former Yugoslavic Republic of Macedonia, called Fyrom. Still, if you want to catch a flight to it, you have to do the drop down to get Fyrom, which they hate as a name. And they had unconstitutionally changed it to Macedonia. But the Greek government next door said, you cannot use the term Macedonia because that's ours, we own it. Because we own Alexander the Great and we own the province of Macedonia, and you people to our north cannot call it a country. So we argued and argued. I was there for 3 months helping on the referendum, and we argued about what to call it. And I'm afraid I gave away one of our state secrets, which Marcin and May will love. I said, well, when you're in trouble about what you describe, you just say here. We are here, without naming the place that you are, because that is contentious. But I say that because that 3 months was salutary about our little other corner of the world, the northern part of Northern Ireland, where we also have 2 million people, where we also argue over language rights and language acts and how we can respect and build on that with equality, where we have settled the territorial claim by referendum of the people in 1998, and where we are making extraordinary progress in world-leading terms, in terms of from conflict to peace and prosperity. And I think we've heard that described a number of times by the contributors here, and that needs to be banked, because in the Western Balkans, where Macedonia is, you see, that's why we use the term in the English language, balkanized, smaller and smaller little pockets of non-viable jurisdictions. And how do you reverse that while respecting people's identity and their culture and their language and build something better? And I think we're closer to that. Now, I often use that old song, reasons to be cheerful, reasons to be fearful. And we've covered some of the reasons to be fearful. We have a gridlock. Now, gridlock was built into the Good Friday Agreement in order to provide a mutual veto. And while we've been out of government for 21 months now, remember there was an earlier period when the executive didn't meet for 9 months because one party wouldn't sign the agenda. So that was the level of the mutual agreement, the mutual veto. So if one side didn't like the agenda, they could stop the process of government. Now, 20 years ago, that was probably necessary as a protection for those who felt concerned and apprehensive about power sharing with an opponent that they had not built a trust with. And that ugly scaffolding, Mark Durkin called it the ugly scaffolding of the agreement, which is so difficult to take down because we didn't have many sunset clauses where elements of it would lapse after 10 or 15 years or be subject to review. And that means that that institutional gridlock, which we now have, is all the more difficult to undo. Reconciliation, we have left that agenda way behind. And we argue about the legacy of the past, and we cannot even find a narrative to describe it. And that dogs us, just as the mental health challenges, the suicide. More people have taken their own lives than in the Troubles. More people have taken their own lives since '98 than in the conflict on the previous 30 years. Extraordinary legacy of pain and hurt and the taking of life. And we cannot deal with those things until we have the political settlement that allows us to work together to reach those people and those neglected and marginalized communities who have had no peace dividend. In terms of the political division, and we've had it today in Martine's excellent contribution, and Peter, unfortunately, on video, so we couldn't have them in the same room and couldn't have those discussions. And it's like, it reminds me of, you know, the children's story, the two donkeys and the pile of grass, you know, where if they go in different directions, neither gets the grass, but if they go in the same direction, they can get one heap of grass and then turn and move to the other. So how do we get that alignment so that we can both eat grass and make that progress? And civil society is an extraordinary power, and around the world, civil society has created revolutions, it has toppled dictatorships, it has changed societies. But I worry that our civil society at home is severely weakened. The business sector, while doing well in some respects, is no longer a voice in some of the debates where it could have a strong contribution. So much of our economy is branch line with headquarters outside and therefore with less decision making. And while I thought it was really interesting, the point that Martine made about the big corporations backing LGBT rights, because for them, in terms of a global economy, they want happy workers and happy communities and happy customers, and that means that recognizing rights and diversity is a virtue for them. And yet so many of our businesses are even smaller than the average. 10% of most economies are small businesses. 90% are small. In our case, it's 95 with 10 or fewer workers. So it's a really small business economy. The trade unions have been hollowed out because of the large industrial plants and the changes in how trade unions organize. Voluntary organizations have been stripped in terms of funding and access, and in some cases their ability to advocate. Really important that they do that, and really important that the big foundations like Carnegie resource and convene in the way that you do so powerfully. And of course, we have the big B, Brexit, about which we know so little and which is going to be cataclysmic whatever happens. Whatever happens, it will have cataclysmic consequences because of the change processes that we'll have to go through, however it's done. On the other hand, we do have an extraordinary peace. I worked with many of you in this room on the Yes campaign in the '98 referendum, and I was looking at lost lives again, that tremendous tribute to those who have lost their lives. I mean, there were 9 voters assassinated in the early months of 1998, before the agreement and after the agreement, before the referendum took place. And that was even before the Omagh bomb later that year. 9 voters were assassinated, and the atmosphere that that created in terms of one's ability to speak, to talk, to relate, to build things was so difficult. It was Bill Clinton who I think was at his best a couple of months ago with Tony Blair and Bertie Ahern, all with clay feet since their great moments 20 years ago. But they gathered in April of this year, and it was Bill Clinton who described the Good Friday Agreement as an act of genius. And so it was, because it was one of those peaceful transitions through the work of politicians, 10 political parties elected to the process, external support through Senator Mitchell and the British and Irish governments and the European Union in a tremendous collective effort then endorsed by the people in referendum. And that created a baseline which we lose at our peril. We have almost sorted police. There is still some issues to be completed on policing to make sure of universal acceptance. The parading issue has been managed almost out of existence. Workplace equality, the Equality Commission say that the data reflects the labour market in terms of Catholic Protestant access to the labour market in their areas. And that baseline is really positive for building a future. And as Teresa amply elucidated, the local councils are working. While Stormont is gridlocked, the political parties, like William and his colleagues and others, are meeting, making decisions, and they're the same parties as are gridlocked at Stormont, and they're showing us how it can be done at local level with support of officers like Teresa and colleagues in the room who are doing amazing things. I think you should be blowing your trumpet a little more loudly about that success of democratic politics still working. It reminds me of the period after the first ceasefires in '94 when the European Union stepped in with its peace programme and where Jacques Delors very farsightedly said that this money needs to go to the bottom. It needs to be bottom up. It needs to involve community-based organisations in partnership with councils and local politicians, with businesses, with trade unions, with the local branches of statutory bodies. And that was innovative, different, and transformational. And I'm delighted that it's now come through as community planning with the same values of elected members locally with the key players and the champions of community interests at the table, not outside with placards complaining that they're being left out and neglected again. We have an economic platform that is hugely promising in certain areas. And we've heard about the fantastic tourism boom, the creative industries, the film industry, all those people who've been through subsidised theatre, and that's why arts will always need to be subsidised, but those people who were carpenters and set designers and lighting designers in the theatres of Northern Ireland now stepping up into the film industry and providing that infrastructure that will be used again and again, both creatively and economically and socially. But what do we do now? And that's where the concept of well-being, I think, is so powerful. Because, again, to go back to Macedonia for a moment, for them, they said, I was saying, well, what do you want to change your name for? And they said, well, we have to change the name because Greece is vetoing our membership of the EU and NATO. So what is the prize? The prize is membership of the EU and NATO. And I was saying, well, that's a process. Those are faraway institutions. You're not going to get your voters to discuss that over breakfast if you want them to be motivated to come out and vote for it. So what is behind the EU and NATO? And of course, it's the well-being of your citizens who can then have the right to travel, who can take part in Erasmus, who can get access to a 500 million customer market, who can have standards of environmental protection and worker protection in the labour market. And that's where the well-being concept, I think, unites all politicians. I tested it in Macedonia and it went down well. So Martin, if you want another project.
there is hunger for it there, because it moves away from that old trope that it's about economic prosperity, jobs and growth, which wasn't terribly motivational other than for those who were going to directly benefit. And again, it wasn't very transformational in terms of what that meant for people participating in that, other than those who were business owners or might get a slightly higher paid job. And that's where the drop-downs that Teresa described are so important in terms of governance, in terms of democracy, in terms of public participation. No peace process works without massive public participation. When the elites get together to cut a deal, it fails. And that is now we have such evidence around the world that the public engagement and involvement, and that's where mature politicians get it, and that's the same for Wellbeing. This Wellbeing program and the fantastic work, and I think the civil service deserve credit in difficult times without political leadership and political sign-off, for having progressed the models and the programs and the action plans and the delivery plans in order to keep it going and hopefully to be able then to implement it when it comes. Because the outcomes that are the description of the well-being can be measured, can be tracked, and can create a coalition of interests to help work and strive towards it. And that's what I think gives us both a political agenda that we are to give to our politicians to provide that settlement, but also a policy agenda for those of us working at different levels to mobilize around and to help achieve that change. And if our job outside of the political world is anything, it's both to understand what's happening, but then to get in and change it for the better. Join us in that project. Thank you.
Thank you very much for taking still the patience to listen to me. I have to say that when you talk today about public governance, a subject that I like very much, then I think there are just two questions that one has to address. The first one is, where do you want to go? And the second is simply to say, and how do we get there? It's pretty basic. And it hasn't really changed a lot. It's just that we are aware of it these days, that it makes a lot of a difference if we have an idea of where we want to go, rather than saying growth of GDP. That was a very, very nice answer at the time when people were really just trying to survive. Then it makes a lot of sense. But once you are beyond that, there are a few other dimensions. Fortunately, the discussion took on well-being. Even it wasn't easy to launch it because it sounded so ominous. When you are in an organization where I was in the OECD, everything is an issue of do we have data or not? And it meant that the whole statistical world started to look for data to show whether we would be going in the right direction, that we would know what it was that we wanted, and that we could actually measure whether we got closer to the subject matter. It's very important. And then, of course, the issue was, and who is going to do it? So we went looking at actors. Who would actually engage? Who would be responsible for bringing us there? All these subjects were part of this review that you mentioned, Teresa, when Simon Hamilton at the time said, since you're doing so much on other countries, why don't you stop by here in Belfast and look at us? And what we found was a pretty surprising subject of research for us, you know, because many people think the OECD is about research. I do think it's a little different, but that's a different discussion. And what we found was that there was a program for government which looked pretty modern, pretty advanced. I would say pretty nice to many other places that I know in the world. It was exactly the time when we were sort of talking about a fantastic new beginning for the country. We looked at strategic vision, we looked at engagement, and we looked at delivery of public services. And it turned out to be, not by chance that we choose these subjects, no. It was what the government wanted to do. And there was already a lot of that in the making. When you then compare it, and that's what we do, we compare it to experiences elsewhere, we felt that this was something that we would take from Belfast. Once it all went well, we would take it to other places and we would say, here's a small part of the world, 2 million people, complicated situation, but they actually managed to do very well. It's a nice story if you want to talk about this. And I think, Martin, I think it is a story for politicians. But it is also a story about people who get engaged. And by that, I don't mean process, I don't mean institutions, I mean the people. This morning when we were listening or watching this impressive presentation, I thought, what is it that people say there? I mean, when the gentleman went into the streets of Belfast and said, what do you want? I think they wanted what we all want, actually. Yeah? We want well-being, and we want to perhaps describe it a bit differently, but that's exactly what we want. So it's not so complicated, but maybe one thing that I always find more increasingly difficult is that people don't listen quite exactly to what people say. This morning, and I will just give you this example, it just struck me because it fits so well, you know. This morning, Lawrence Summers, a very well-known economist in this world, writes in the Financial Times about his trip through America. And he is really an excellent economist. There's no doubt about it. So what I'm saying here is just, what does he say? Traveling through America for 2 weeks, his country, he discovers how different life is, how beautiful the country is, how different the ideas are about what people in different parts of the country would like to do, like to live, like to have. And he said, well, maybe we economists haven't quite seen and listened what it was that people are looking for. This comes from someone who is definitely a great economist. And being myself an economist, I'd like to think of him of, it's a certain sure value. But maybe that's an indication of what is also sometimes missing and increasingly missing. We're not looking enough to what people actually want. And this is not an issue of political partisanship. It's of delivering something that needs government. There you will hear me saying that loud and clear. It needs government, but it is something that you can introduce if you are a good political leader. 2 things, though, that I would like to add. There is something that, you know, when you said it here, now unfortunately this little sign is gone. Carnegie has this fantastic thing to say, changing minds and changing lives. It's a beautiful way to think about what has to be done. Changing minds. We can invent, like people like myself, we can invent fantastic governance systems. I have a lot of things to offer. I will spare you all of that. Beautiful things. But it will only work if there is the right mindset. It will not work as a technique. It will work with the people who do it. And what would it be? I think still government is something which is a concept of government by, of, and for people. That's what it is. And I do think that applies in Northern Ireland as in nearly all places of the world. Thank you very much.
Okay, so three perspectives. Yeah, I'd like to invite you to think about bringing that back to the argument that Marcin had advanced, that a country can cope with a hiatus in government if the other elements of the country continue to function. If local government continues to function healthily, if civic society functions healthily, and official institutions that don't act under the day-to-day direction of ministers, and as Rolf was arguing, if there's a genuine engagement of people in the conversation. And I would just like to reinforce a point that Rolf made. Like Rolf, I spend a certain amount of time in a variety of countries having a similar conversation about how governments can reconnect with citizens' own view of what they want for the future of their societies. And I do that on the back of Scotland's experience of trying to travel that journey. In every conversation I have had in various countries, including the one that Rolf and I were having in Slovenia only a year ago, that conversation stops when you get to the point of saying, let's do something, let's change something. It's only in Northern Ireland in 2017 that the conversation went past that point and said, let's actually translate this thinking into action. Let's create a well-being framework. Let's create a program for government that's based on that well-being framework. So I think we're all in our various ways saying that if Marcin is right, that a society can function with on the basis of what all the other bits are doing, then Northern Ireland has a number of powerful, functioning cards here. And that's our transition point, I think, to the next panel that's going to think about whether Northern Ireland can make that journey from those foundations. So thank you very much for your attention, and we will hand over to the next panel.
9. Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you to Marcin. It's like Elvis has left the building. And we wish him a safe journey home, and we really do appreciate him setting the scene and indeed starting off such an eloquent debate. And I do want to try and make a little bit of time for Q&A, because I think there's such a richness in what we've heard. It would be a tragedy not to be able to, the three previous speakers who've set the scene. And what I took from it actually was, whilst they were looking at the challenges, they also gave out a lot of hope and optimism that there's nothing that we can't do. And I think that's what this session is about, the Northern Ireland that we want. And that was the question posed. What is that? And without further ado, and I'll say a few things at the end, I'm delighted to welcome to the stage, Rolf, you also included, wherever you are. We do have an economist with a heart here. It's beating. I know it, I've seen it in action, and he does have a social conscience. So delighted to welcome Neil Gibson, who'll be well known in Northern Ireland, but also head of, your actual title in Ernst Young, the main economic advisor for the island of Ireland. We also have Katrina Godfrey, and to congratulate her, she's very newly become a permanent secretary in the Department of Infrastructure in Northern Ireland, but also was the authoress or architect, or whatever we want to call it, of what we heard earlier in the other contributors to the fact that we do have a programme for government that's outcomes-based. People often forget the people behind the scenes who are the ones that actually push the policy process and encourage ministers and other people in the system to allow these things to happen. And Katrina was very much an architect and someone behind the scenes there to make sure that we've got a programme for government that is as it is. And then, last but not least by any means, and in particular, thank you, Jennifer Wallace, who is literally now recognised globally for her expertise in well-being, had a burst appendix. These things you cannot warrant for. And I know that we send our best wishes to her for a speedy recovery. And I know that she's really gutted not to be here, but she'll be watching the podcast and making sure that we've all covered everything she told us to say. And Lucy and Ali are smiling there. But we're thrilled that Deirdre Garvey, who very kindly stepped in at Martin's bequest, because Deirdre also is an outside view and given us her opinions at the end of this panel, works in a Dublin-based organisation called the Wheel, well, Ireland-based, I should say, which caters for the community and voluntary sector in the south of Ireland, and has worked very closely with Carnegie. So it shows the breadth of the Carnegie work on the island of Ireland. Indeed, the fact that we're a trust that actually has the jurisdiction of the UK and Ireland. It's one of the very few philanthropic organisations that does. And that shared learning also brings a really important perspective to this. So without further ado, I'm going to ask them to share their reflections on the Northern Ireland that we would want. I'm eating McGinley.
Thank you. I'm not eating McGinley. Thank you, Aideen. Yeah, it's an absolute privilege and a pleasure to be here. As Aideen said, I'm Neil Gibson. I'm the Chief Economist for EY in the island of Ireland, and formerly a Professor of Economic Policy at the University of Ulster, where I was, Ulster University as it is now, when we were involved in the Roundtable, which was a huge privilege for me to be involved in. Not least because I learnt a huge amount. Rolf made a great point about Larry Summers' article, and economists don't tend to do a huge amount of listening. I've spent a lot of time building forecast models, more maths than you could possibly ever wish to see in your life, and not enough listening. And the process of the Roundtable was fantastic for me to hear and think a little bit differently about the way I go about my business. And in EY, we have a tagline, as corporates tend to do, and ours is building a better working world. And for some in the firm, that's a challenge to get your head around and think what that means. But it was to their credit that they still wanted me to be involved and wanted me to be here, because we should be here. We're a huge employer on the island. We're working for most of the large corporates, and we're trying to make money. And that's quite important for the reasons I'm going to talk about now when we talk about the economy that we want going forward. I want to start, it's also a great privilege to be talking about the opportunities going forward, because normally economists are wheeled out to tell you just how big the problem is and how much worse it's going to get. So it's a great honour to have that opportunity today. And I think there's only a couple of remarks I'd really want to make to set the scene. The first one is we have a huge amount of potential in Northern Ireland. There is much to be hugely proud of, not least the list of firms that we heard coming over to Northern Ireland, and they don't come there out of any deference, pity, or coming to try and help or boost the economy. They come because it's a good business decision to come. It's a fantastic quality of life. Northern Ireland tops so many of the quality of life indicator measures that there are. It's important to recognise we have a very privileged funding position where we sit in Northern Ireland, but that does allow us to afford an excellent education and healthcare system. Yes, they have problems and challenges, but compared to many places in the world, still hugely impressive. And those things don't happen by accident. It would surprise most to know we have a lower unemployment rate than the UK average. We have a lower unemployment rate than Ireland. We have many economic problems. We've heard of some of them earlier on in the day, and I'm not going to reiterate those because we're trying to look forward. So we've got a platform to build on. The Northern Ireland that is developed in the future should be true to those things that make it unique and special, the things that have made it the strong performer in many ways that it is. Yes, we've very many challenges to face, but there's a platform there to build from. And that's what takes us to the sort of well-being work and the programme for government that we have. That's not a political document, which is a huge achievement in a place like Northern Ireland. It's not politicised. There's not a party about to come into power and take it down and say, that's not my idea, I want something different. There is a genuine consensus that that's roughly the direction that we'd like to head in. Yes, there are challenges about the outcome framework, and there are many people angsting over whether it's quite the right indicator or whether it's exactly the right measure. But we have a document and a platform that roughly sets out where we want to get to. And Rolf made that point earlier. That's the first and most important part of the conversation about the economy that we want going forward. The economy that we want, not the economy that I want, not the economy that many policymakers want, but are we sure we're listening to all of our citizens? And something that came out of not just the roundtable for me, but certainly is coming out of the consultations that went in through the crafting of the programme for government, is hearing from the voices of the people who typically don't turn up. You run a public event, how do you get the people to come who don't? Where's the silent voice in a lot of this about the things that people are uncomfortable with? And if you don't listen to those things, you will get votes, and I don't need to reference them. You know the votes that surprised us. It's to my eternal shame that as an economist, I didn't think the Brexit vote was going to go the way that it did. And that has bothered me ever since and tells me I didn't read the right indicators. It tells me that I wasn't paying enough attention to some of the statistics. And if I'd spent a bit of time with the real wages chart, or if I'd spent something with people's perceptions of their quality of public services, I might have had a better understanding. And I have to be a better economist. I have to do better. If we're going to deliver a better economy, we're all going to have to do better. That includes my profession. So we've got to think about, are we sure that we've got the right framework of what the things are that matter to people? And that's why I love the wellbeing framework. I love the fact that we bring democratic outcomes, social outcomes, economic outcomes, all together, environmental outcomes, and really think about what we want and what the trade-offs might be between some of those choices. And it's extremely important that the private sector plays its part. Many of us in the room today, many of the people who listen to this, will have some direct or indirect funding from the public sector. All of the great government officials that we have, the politicians that we all need that income from somebody generating the revenue. The money has to be redistributed. And while sometimes I felt like a sort of grumpy taxpayer at the round table occasionally, it was important to keep that on the table. That we have to generate, if we're relying on philanthropy, if we're relying on taxes to be generated, then we're going to have a vibrant economy to underpin the things that we want to do. Not everything in the frameworks costs money, but many of them do. And the health outcomes and the education outcomes that we want will require us to have a dynamic and successful economy. They will need us to continue the great success that Invest NI has had. It will continue to nurture the small businesses that we have and continue to have big firms like the one I work for, continuing to generate significant revenue and continue to help their clients to do so. So that's been a really interesting part of the story for me, is where does the generation of income, we have to make sure that as we craft a new vision of well-being, we don't lose sight of the importance of the ability to make profit, to make an economic success of a business, so that we have the money to redistribute. I always tell the story that the reason I became an economist was a very famous speech given by a political leader back when I was only 8 or 9, who said in a speech, and you'll know who I'm referring to, before you ask me to write a check for this problem, ask yourself whose money it is. And that never left me from a very young age. why don't we just print more money? Didn't think I would live through that, but I did. But anyway, little quantitative easing joke there, and don't normally get that in. But it was a fascination to me. How do we make the choices? How do we decide what matters? And how are we going to do that if we don't listen to the people? A great experience for me working in the Northwest, Derry, Londonderry, in the City of Culture bid with Aideen and Gavin, with many others, was hugely inspiring to me because I had to change the language of what I talked about to try and persuade people why we needed some of the big professional services firms coming to that city to generate the taxes for all the other things that we wanted to do to make that place special. And the other point about opportunity and forward that I think I must tie into this is, yes, we need a vibrant economy. That's one of the things that I think should be a bedrock of what we're aspiring to deliver in Northern Ireland. We shouldn't lose sight of it. The private sector is going to have to play its part with the public sector, with the voluntary sector, the third sector, and with the public. We've got to stay close to our public. People have spent many a day crafting policy solutions. I have spent a lot of time worrying about things like economic inactivity or leaving young people behind with no formal skills, which still happens sadly too much in Northern Ireland. And I've realized that I've often been in rooms with experts and officials trying to craft a policy solution for a life I have never lived. I don't understand what it's like. I don't understand the emotional challenges. We have to have more people in the room thinking and crafting on these solutions. And yes, that includes the people who are there advocating for the need to have a fast-growing, successful and dynamic economy. And in that, really, to sort of wrap up, what I wanted to say is, if we're going to have a successful economy, then everyone's going to have to play their part. We're going to struggle to pick winners, although we will try. So we'll try to say it's going to be digital, it's going to be life sciences, it's going to be... We try to pick winners, and that won't work. There'll be sectors we can't even imagine today. There will be successful businesses in areas we thought were long since defunct or no longer the sorts of industries that we would have in somewhere like Northern Ireland. So we've got to look more at the individual. And for those people that we're looking to support and to help with some of the big, big challenges, mental health one, a huge issue, we're going to have to make sure that we have a way in which we can get a proper social partnership in which we all play a part in trying to bring people into the economy so that they can play their part and bring the taxpayers, many of whom remain sceptical about how some of the money is redistributed. We have to bring them closer to understanding why those safety nets and help-ups need to be there and why we need a proper social and economic fabric. And I think that gives me my lasting remark, which is the opportunity is there for a fantastic Northern. I would argue it's already a fantastic place. But there's also an absolute requirement to put well-being at the heart of what we do. It's budget season at the moment, Irish budget today, UK budget coming shortly. And look at the papers tomorrow, and they will be full of very laudable and very cleverly worked out calculators of who's a euro or a pound better off or a dollar better off. And sometimes I think that's the wrong lens to look at it. Is the society or is the economy that we live in better? And that may not mean every one individual is going to be €3 or $4 better off. Because if we look at our aging demographics, if we look at our longevity in life and the healthcare issues, if we look at some of the challenges, the growing challenges around things like mental health or physical things such as obesity, we simply will not be able to continue in the way that we're going without having some... Climate change is another one. If you don't put those frameworks at the heart of what you're going to do, we simply won't be able to keep up. The taxpayer won't. We're going to have a big, modern, grown-up conversation about the tax that we want to pay. And we have no framework for that conversation yet. And so having a programme for government that allows us to have difficult conversations about how we're going to fund the health service, how we're going to fund the way to the outcomes that we want, is the sort of modern conversation that I want to have. The roundtable was a great place to discuss. We heard it this morning. There's not enough of that going on. You have to be learning all the time. It's been a great privilege for me to learn as part of it. And I think keeping that perspective on the sort of economy we want going forward requires a lot of listening and less talking. Not easy for me to do. But it also requires us, because the demographics, the social change, the climate change tells us that without that kind of holistic approach, we'll be in a much more difficult place than we are today. So it's a necessity to allow us to deliver the sort of Northern Ireland that we aspire to. I hope we get there and hope that myself and my organisation will be able to play its part. Thank you very much.
you, Neil and Erin. I'd like to add my words of thanks to Carnegie Trust and the Carnegie Council for the opportunity to be here and to be debating these issues today. As Erin has explained, my name's Katrina Godfrey. Until about just over a month ago, I had the privilege of leading the development of the outcomes-based programme for government in Northern Ireland. I've recently moved to take on a new set of responsibilities at the Department for Infrastructure, but the experience of leading a wellbeing focused programme for government, I think, is one that will stay with me and is already shaping how I take on my current role. You've heard a lot about why we ended up with a framework that focused very firmly on wellbeing and that took a long-term strategic view. There's no need for me to rehearse that, but what I will say was it was remarkable how easy and how possible it was for so many people to coalesce around a strategic view that took the longer term and that focused on what people told us mattered most to them. And really, I suppose, the other thing it forced us to do was to realise that all of the things we said were really, really important to us. We hadn't actually managed to improve over the last couple of decades in the way we wanted to see them improved. So Neil talked about economic inactivity. We look at some of the environmental, some of the health indicators. They simply weren't shifting in the way that we knew people wanted them to do. So that really required us to take a new approach. But this session's about opportunity. It's about looking forward. And if there's anything I've learned in my 2 years leading this piece of work on behalf of the government in Northern Ireland, it's been the importance of leadership, because actually my role is as a senior leader in our public service. And my primary responsibility, I think I realise now, is not to put processes in place, not to find evidence, but actually to build capacity. To build the capacity of the department I now lead and to build the capacity of our system. And for me, 4 areas are absolutely critical to maximising the opportunities of a wellbeing framework. Some of them have already been referred to this afternoon. The first one is collaboration. We can't solve many of the challenges we and so many other societies face by working in silos. We know intuitively that health outcomes are determined not by what happens in hospitals and health institutions, but by what happens in societies and communities and families and in schools. So how do we work together to make sure that the focus is on the outcomes we're trying to achieve and not a narrow set of responsibilities that we have? How do we build partnerships? How do we even understand what affects what? And how do we know we're making a difference? That takes me to the second of my 4 areas. It's about impact. Any of us who work in public service will tend to have laudable aims. We'll tend to know what it is we want to achieve. We have been less good at holding ourselves to account for the impact, at really asking ourselves, how do we know, did that work? How do we know, is anybody better off as a result of the policy, the programme, the intervention that I've been responsible for leading? And that's one of the other changes that a focus on outcomes has brought for us, that sense of really testing ourselves with the question, is anybody better off as a result of the thing I've spent public money on, invested time in, put in place? The third thing, and this speaks very much to one of the points that Neil mentioned earlier, is the intelligent use of evidence. We are coming down, like many governments, with data. We are really good at measuring stuff, but I'm not so sure we're good at measuring the stuff that really matters. In Northern Ireland, we produce something like, I think it's over 250 different official statistics publications every year. But actually, we've lost, in many areas, the skill of analysing them to see what they're actually telling us. What are they telling us about real lived experiences of public services and how they impact on people? And actually, we've started just to understand that evidence takes many different forms, that evidence isn't just data, statistics, research. It's also the lived experiences of people who use, who care about, or who deliver public services. So one of the areas of capacity that I need to build in the people that I lead is the ability really to understand the evidence in its fullest and widest sense. And that takes me to the fourth area that seems, from my experience of this work, really important. And it's the area of inclusivity. It's really that sense of being much more inclusive in how we design and how we deliver policies and programmes. The round table has been a metaphor for today. Who's at the table? Who's involved? How do we involve people right at the outset? And how do we keep them involved? So co-design, co-production, very, very commonly heard words at the moment, but actually those aren't set pieces. They're not one-offs. They're conversations that need to continue so that we know whether what we're trying to achieve is doing what we thought it was going to be doing. So in summing up and in looking at opportunities, I guess I'm saying my leadership challenge is really to grow and change our public services in Northern Ireland so that those four characteristics that I've mentioned become the norm in how we do our business, not the exception that they too frequently are. For me, that's how we'll grow opportunity, and it's also how we'll grow well-being for all. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm the last speaker of the day. I'm the joker in the pack because I'm in a panel talking about the Northern Ireland that we want. And I don't live in Northern Ireland. I'm not going to talk about work that was done in Northern Ireland. But hey-ho, stay with me for the journey. And I hope by the time I have about 6 minutes to speak that we'll get to the end of it. My name is Deirdre Garvey. I'm CEO of The Wheel, which is the National Association for Community, Voluntary, Charity Organisations, Civil Society, Non-Profit, variety of different names, I guess, and we might use the words non-profit because of the country that we're in. That would be the term that would be used here. So for those of you who are familiar with Northern Ireland, our sister organisation in the north of Ireland would be NICFA, the Northern Irish Council for Voluntary Action. So having put me in a box and pigeonholed me, what I'm here to do is to share a little bit of the relevant learnings that we have found with our work with Martin and John and the Carnegie UK Trust and Jen particularly, who isn't here. For the past 5 years, we have been engaging in a listening exercise, listening to people. The bottom root of it is obviously changing minds, changing lives. It is the well-being remit of the Carnegie UK Trust. But it is about participation and what people want and how to listen to people and what they are saying and what that means. We have an architecture in Ireland as local government and around well-being. We have written well-being planning into our non-profit organisations and umbrellas at local level. So we have a mechanism, we have a series of processes. We haven't put a significant amount of money into that process, so it will be interesting. It's very interesting for me to take the learnings from this and actually bring them back to that process at local level back in the Republic. And we haven't quite understood how to engage that local level and the wellbeing plans that are being created with the national agenda and the national programme for government. So we're ahead and we're behind in different ways, and that's what makes occasions like this actually really productive and very enriching. So thank you very much for the opportunity. So for the last 5 years, we've been engaging deliberative dialogue, conversations, asking people to consider basically what is shaping our future and what is expected by citizens and what is expected of citizens. And I use the word citizen there in a sort of a people context as opposed to a legal context. So people connected with the Republic of Ireland and who live there and those who also don't live there, including some of these conversations were in prisons. So we expand all of the socioeconomic frame, I guess, cycle and the life cycle. And it was very interesting when you get people together and give them those conversations in safe places and repeated conversations. The conversations did distill upwards into, let's call them the grand challenges of our time. the climate change and global warming, the persistence of poverty, the growing inequality between the so-called developed countries, the migration crisis, the pending energy crisis, and I guess the changing nature of the media, I guess, and the powerful and indeed the unaccountable forces shaping our opinions on things, and indeed the power of the commercial markets in our lives. So these, you know, we're talking about opportunities here, but these are the things that came up in these grand themes, and participation of people in public decision making was a key, I guess, identified theme that was central to not just solving the local issues, but also feeding into these grand challenges. So what was found is that, I guess, a conclusion, I guess, and this work is still ongoing, is that we need to basically involve people more in participative democratic processes and in participative, rather than transactional, market processes. So basically, that was a really, I guess, how to do that, I then became the next question. So when we talk about participative market processes, you know, you do come across questions like, well, how much growth is enough? You know, and how do we decide that? And how do we deliberate that? And what does that mean in terms of regulation or intervention in the market forces that do shape our lives, particularly in the Republic of Ireland as a global, I guess, very, very vulnerable to the global markets that come through Ireland. So, and what was also very interesting is that process of engaging in deliberative dialogue changes people. And it does make people different. And I guess what it boils down to is that the engagement, if we're really going to listen to people and if we're really going to participate people in determining the why and the where to and the goal, then we need to get away from, I guess, the adversarial type of politics and into more, I guess, appreciative alternatives, so that the search for the truth, is actually followed by a number of people. So it's very interesting to hear that despite the challenges that the Northern Ireland cultural identities and communities have, this wasn't a political process getting to the concept of community planning and well-being. So it is very interesting that there is a truth there if there is an appropriate, I guess, process to go there. We have two really solid examples of how the public discourse and Ireland has changed significantly in the Republic of Ireland. Two, I guess, recent referendums in the last 5 years were instigated by civil society engaging and persuading government to run citizens' assemblies and constitutional convention, a deliberative democratic process that ultimately did provide political cover for the politicians. We also know of examples of citizens' juries in the local authority level in Galway, whereby randomly citizens picked were engaging about improving public services locally. So the participants really were very clear that the politics in the country has to, I guess the politics and the commerce have to support people to participate in decision making across all of these realms. It has to support people to be free from domination and exploitation by others, and it has to be aimed at, I guess, securing a sustainable future for ourselves and our children on this Mother Earth that we all have. So it made some recommendations that are relevant for the discourse here. And the participants really very strongly felt that what we really need to do to address this distrust and mistrust and gap and disrespect and division, that we have to make deliberative decision-making processes central to our democratic and our commercial worlds. We used to have a structure called social partnership in our country. It has its flaws. But it was a discourse and a dialogue and a space for ongoing dialogue. And we've learned things since then, and we can learn things, I think, from the north of Ireland too. But that is an absolutely critical must, both in the commercial and in the democratic worlds. We have to develop and nurture a sense of people in our country as active citizens rather than passive consumers or electors. We are not consumers or customers. We are citizens in our relationship with public services and public engagement of the state. We have to invest in civil society voice and advocacy to strengthen associational life. We have to understand citizenship in today's world as being global. It's not national in nature or even regional in nature. Everything is connected with these global trends and global problems. And finally, is that participants in the conversation, the people's conversation, really felt that the most important thing is to ensure that all people have the material means to basically participate to a standard that the people in this room would regard as acceptable in the 21st century. And while poverty and gross inequality exists in the midst of global plenty, we can't really claim to have a genuine participatory democracy. And we need to end and prioritise the ending of world poverty as part of this engagement as global citizens. And as I finish up, I wanted to offer not offer a framework, it's not me offering it, but remind us of a framework, because we've spoken about a framework of well-being. And the themes that the Carnegie UK Trust's work on the Citizens People Conversation project are linked in terms of that putting people at the centre of the what and the life and what kind of society we want. But the Sustainable Development Goals are a framework that I believe is a framework for that unites the Republic of Ireland and the North of Ireland and our basically our fellow citizens of the world in England, Scotland and Wales, you know, either pre or post-Brexit. Does it really matter? And I'd just like to offer that as a sort of a framework through which we can look at societies as what the what is as opposed to what the process is. And those institutions that we've spoken about, you know, are a way of, I guess, all pointing this oil tanker in a similar direction. So thank you for bearing with me. I hope, as the view of an outsider, looking at a participative process that isn't directly taking place in Northern Ireland, but definitely on the island of Ireland. And I think this engagement has been really valuable in really just understanding where I now understand where the Carnegie UK Trust is active in Northern Ireland. And I think the two areas and realms of work are very complementary. So thank you again. And thank you, Aideen.
Things that really strike you that you want to either comment to make or a question to pose, and would ask obviously the other speakers as well to be prepared to from the floor if you don't mind. Anybody want to make an observation or a comment or something that strikes you from what you've heard? I mean, for me, there's been a really interesting link of the vacuum, central and local with global and local. And tomorrow we're going to get a chance with the participants from the three councils to really dive deep and talk about very specific practice from the US. So today was very much setting the scene, but there was a very general sense, I think, of optimism. Or is there just there? I'm Rona McClure, and I'm here as Vice Chair of the three Chief Officers of the third sector. And I have to say, I was a little bit distressed by our politicians and the view that they have. And yet, there's wonderful things happening in Northern Ireland. And of course, I, as a chief executive of an organisation, can see that. But unfortunately, the young people and the adults that my organisation serve don't. My organisation, Start 360, works with the most complex and challenging young people in Northern Ireland, further away from the labour market, marginalised, forgotten, I think, and invisible. And I'm just wondering, the hiatus that we say that we may be able to fill with the opportunities that have been very well and eloquently brought to this roundtable today, does serve the chattering classes very well. But I don't believe it is serving those young people, adult offenders and the families
that, that my organisation works with. And in fact, from a CO3 perspective, the chief executives would very clearly say that, you know, in our sector, because that's who we are working with. So I just would like to get a sense of, I mean, these people were mentioned, you know, the educational disadvantage, the mental health issues, the increase in suicide, things not really changing for them. And it is distressing me that Martine and Peter could not be here and share the same space. I'd like to know why that was, to be honest. Is that a question? Is that the elephant in the room? And the grim prospect that, you know, that we're not going to have a devolved government for a very long time. So maybe we are, you know, we have opportunities, but, you know, the hope in the communities that I work in across Northern Ireland is starting to dissipate, and that's the reality.
All I would say to that is, and I don't sympathy for the plight, but some of the problems we've been talking about were here when we had an executive, when now we don't, and before when we didn't, before the one that we did have. So that tells us these are hard problems. And one thing, and it's not a positive, I'm not suggesting that there's any good news in not having local representation, but it does give you a little bit of freedom to say, well, what way do we craft this? So we can make progress so that, as I say, the wellbeing framework isn't a politicised document, so nobody who does come back is going to unpick it very quickly. So the question is, what do you line up as the choices that you would like? What sort of tax changes would we want to see? What sort of policy choices would we make? So actually the progress that can be made, we must not allow ourselves to feel as downbeat as you sound there, because we all feel it at times, but we've got to try and make the progress so that when they come back, there's a list of papers to say, this is what needs done, and in this order, and these are the priorities. Any hope that we don't put our back into the efforts now and then come back and stand looking at them, the political leaders, like thrushes at feeding time, and saying, okay, fix this for me, won't work. So all I can say is try to keep your spirit up, try to put all of our energies into having the list ready for the things that need done, in which order and how they'll be paid for, so that we can get on when it returns. So I feel like that sometimes, but feel a duty not to get sucked into that and try to make the progress that we can so that we have a good table of work for them when they come back. Why does that happen after I say something? That's always the way, Eddie.
Can I just say something very, very quickly? And I think that the lady's point is very well made. I mean, in the absence of having a working executive, I have found Washington, we have a lot of people coming out from Northern Ireland, most of whom are somewhere involved in the community sector. And their message is very much along what you're saying, that, you know, there are areas, I think it was my point earlier, that while the rising tide of economic development is basically helping the middle classes, there is a significant portion of Northern Ireland people that haven't benefited from it. And so my dichotomy in my job is, on the one end, I'm talking about inward investment's gone up, tourism's gone up, and then on the other hand, I'm going up on the hill to ask people in Congress to continue to give money to the International Fund for Ireland or to the American Ireland Fund to continue to support projects at home. And I think that sort of that messaging I have to do is somewhat fork-tongued at times. But there is most definitely, as far as America is concerned, still a lot of work and support needs to be done, essentially for those, I don't mean they're forgotten, that's not the right word, it sounds too pejorative, but certainly are still struggling. And in the absence of a functioning executive, the people that are coming out and being supported by the US Consulate General are, generally speaking, people from your sector who are saying, you know, hold on a second, you know, there are very real issues here. And I've only one point to Neil, and I'm going to shut up after this. I thought it was very interesting you were saying that you needed to have policy from the ground up. that, you know, you couldn't sit in an ivory tower and tell people what they needed. But in those conversations that you would be having in that wider section of society, is there also an understanding of responsibility? Because one of the big things here in society is that, yes, everybody must have their say, but every individual group also has a responsibility, and it's not something that they can, you know, abdicate, you know, to some other higher social group. So that's really a question more than a comment.
Two things that I always mention in this context. So we have to have the empathy to try and understand situations and circumstances that are very difficult if you haven't lived that life. But equally, if we're really going to get the society that we want, everyone will have a responsibility to that. So it won't all be about finding new pots of funding and money to support things. It'll be to find funding to fund problems out of existence that we won't need money for anymore. It'll be about amalgamating funding, and the real proof of the pudding will come when we have a wellbeing framework that says we're going to stop doing something. That one's not working. We're going to put our money here. That is a very painful and difficult conversation. But we'll only get there if everyone feels a responsibility. I live in a region and in a state in which I will be fully supported to achieve my hopes and dreams. There will be a safety net there to help me. But I'll play my part. And that's where that lack of trust between taxpayers and between those outside of the tax net really needs to be improved. And we will not do that by keeping those groups apart when they're having conversations. So absolutely responsibility, but empathy on the part of people who maybe are trying to understand lives they've never lived.
And tomorrow the journey continues to try and find some solution.
Great. Thank you all very much. Thank you. I just want to thank you all for coming. I'm delighted to hear that the journey continues tomorrow, and I'm sure beyond that as well. This is not the kind of work that gets done in a day, or a week, or a month, or a year. And I know you were in it for the long haul, and I really admire that. And I admire you all for coming and sharing your time with us. Time's the most precious thing. You spent the whole afternoon with us, and we really appreciate it. I want to say a few thank yous. I want to thank again the Carnegie UK Trust and its leadership, Chairman John Ovich, and CEO Martin Evans. It's always a pleasure working with you. Being an executive here at Carnegie Council, I know that is a great responsibility, but we have a lot of people doing a lot of work. And I know your staff have done a terrific job, and I wanted to thank them for their efforts. Allison, Lucy, and Lauren in particular, thank you for making this happen. Delegates from the Northern Ireland Bureau here helping us with planning this. Thank you for all of that. So, Martin, did you have any parting words? Yeah. Just for doing all the work on the other side of being elected. Our goal is to keep your blessing. Yeah, so that's good. No, it's really our pleasure. We even have a hashtag now. This was really a good day for us. So I know that most of us, I think all of us, have been invited to the British residence. This is the residence of the Consul General, UK Consul General. So I have an address here, which is 351 East 51st Street at First Avenue, Penthouse 1. So we have some cards that have this on it. Is that correct? So if anybody needs the precise address on their way out, we can give it to you.
That's absolutely right. But if people could gather, one of my staff will be on the entrance to take everyone up. It's Penthouse 1, but there will be someone from my office there to greet people on arrival, because not everybody will arrive together. Correct. But Richard and I will try and be there just before 5:30.
Okay, thank you. And we're going to do this New York style, which is sort of every person for him or herself. So you have some options. I think we have time if people want to walk. I'm told it's about, Norman, do you know it's about 15-minute walk? About a 15-minute walk. Clear on
Third Avenue, Second Avenue, First Avenue.
Right. Just follow the numbers. We can do it. Right. So either that, or we can there'll be taxis. We can flag down here on Lexington Avenue. Let's take a taxi. If anybody has any special needs, just let us know. Right. Okay. Great. Thank you all.
You're like, take this. Didn't have to think.